This is the history of One Punch Man. After watching this video, you'll be a certified expert in One Punch Man history, which of course is the highest honor any Caped Baldy fan can possibly have, right? One Punch Man might not be the first series that comes to mind when you think of deep and fascinating lore.
Leave me alone!
But believe it or not, the series has a very interesting and relatively well documented history that dates back thousands of years once you piece together all of the information provided in the manga, bonus chapters, and some portion of the webcomic. Don't worry though, if you haven't read the webcomic, I won't be touching on spoiler stuff until the very end, so I'll make sure to let you know once I get there. I gotcha. I decided it was best to split the timeline we'll be going over into two parts, before Saitama and after Saitama, aka BS and AS, which is referring to everything that happens before Saitama was born and pretty much everything that we see play out in the manga. This means that the current year in the story is 25 AS because Saitama is currently 25 years old. Make sense? Well, even if it doesn't, I'm sorry, but you know, we gotta get started. So with that out of the way, let's start with what is probably the earliest sign of human life in One Punch Man, the underground base of the Monster Association. In the manga, in the heat of the Monster Association arc, Saitama, Flashy Flash, and Monako ride a rail cart through the underground base of the Monster Association, and this is also when we find out that this was actually originally the home of the Subterraneans and possibly even others before that. The architecture of the base is definitely a giveaway that this underground city is likely thousands of years old at the minimum. One thing that kind of verifies this is the mural of God shown in chapter 112 of the manga. It was first revealed in this chapter after Orochi is one-shotted by Saitama. The impact of the punch starts destroying the altar room that they're in. Orochi then crawls towards the crumbling altar, still thinking it was his, but as the altar room is collapsing, the entirety of the mural was revealed to be one created for God, not Orochi. There's a lot that can be unpacked with this mural, like the writing prophesizing God's return, and the fact that this dude in the corner here is just casually chucking a baby in the air. I feel like nobody really talks about that, but anyways, all that aside, for our purposes, we need this mural to establish a timetable of how far back the recorded history of One Punch Man actually goes. This is likely the oldest evidence of human activity we've seen so far in the series, and its hieroglyphic style likely means that it dates back to the One Punch Man version of Egyptian times. We can also see in a bonus illustration of one of the recent One Punch Man volumes that there's this little room with the God Cube and a sarcophagus which supports this timetable. If we're going by real life standards, this sets a potential starting point of about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, but we'll just set 5000 BS as our first point in the One Punch Man timeline. As a side note, there is a part in the manga where Sairochi depicts two Adam and Eve type characters as the first humans eating an apple that seems to be from some kind of like weird snake monster. Although this might be hinting to something that actually happened and might also be a sign of God's influence in humanity from the very beginning, it might have also simply been a visualization of what Psychos was talking about at the time, so we'll, you know, ignore that for now. Now for the next bit of One Punch Man world lore, we actually have to fast forward to a future moment about the past that still hasn't technically happened yet in the manga. Very confusing, but in less confusing terms, there was a major event that occurred 800 years ago before the present timeline that was revealed in the webcomic. So that being said, we have to go into spoiler territory for the rest of the video. Alright, with that said, let's talk about the story of the Cruel Dragon from chapter 119 of the webcomic. In this chapter, Saitama stumbles across this like real life LARPing situation where these guys in medieval armor tell Saitama about a cruel dragon that once existed 800 years ago and once terrorized humanity. In just a matter of days, it took countless lives and destroyed whatever land it touched down on. Eventually, many brave heroes fought hard enough to weaken the dragon, and seal masters quickly trapped the essence of the dragon into 9 seal stones that are now being stored and protected at 9 temples. It turns out that there's also an enemy group called Deathbone that is trying to reawaken the dragon and have been at constant battle with the knights for hundreds of years. Saitama sees this as an opportunity to fight a super strong monster, so he goes on to speedrun all of the temples, collects all of the seal stones, and finally resurrects the dragon just to, you know, one-shot it and find his way to the supermarket before they close in order to buy some bananas. Although this comes off as a funny throwaway sequence to kick off the chapter, it can't be ignored that the seal stones that were described in the story very much resemble the god cubes that were revealed in the manga. On top of this, many keen readers might have also noticed a very sneaky piece of foreshadowing placed in the manga during Saitama's fight with Garo. After Garo hits Saitama into the ground so freaking hard that it bulges the other side of the planet, that bulging piece of land rose from the ocean to uncover this ancient temple that has a certain cruel dragon statue placed on top of it. Many speculate that this was actually an avatar of God that rose to destroy the earth 800 years ago, and the sealing of the cruel dragon parallels what seems to be going on with God. Touching the god cubes allows you to communicate with him, much like the seal stones are used to reach the dragon. The essence of the dragon is sealed away in the stones, and it seems like God's physical body might also be locked away in the moon somehow. Now, if the story of the cruel dragon really is just a retelling of the time that God was first sealed 800 years ago, it kind of makes you wonder if the events that are happening in the manga right now is really just history repeating itself. And if that's the case, then that means that there might have been a Saitama type character 800 years ago that, much like Saitama, was this normal everyday guy that trained so hard that he eventually removed his limiter and became strong enough to defeat the cruel dragon. Pretty cool to think of a medieval times Saitama, isn't it? Under normal circumstances, it would have been likely that the manga version of One Punch Man would cut this cruel dragon story out entirely, but seeing as how seeds for this small storyline have already been planted, it's a safe bet that we can add this to our timeline. So this is officially the next point on our timeline, 800 BS. For the next piece of history that'll close the gap between 800 years BS and the day Saitama was born, we actually have to once again return to chapter 119 of the webcomic, which is of course where I just explained all this cruel dragon story stuff came from. Later in this chapter, Amai Mask takes Saitama out to a restaurant in order to recruit him to be the face of the Hero Association. Before getting to all that stuff though, Amai Mask briefly covers a portion of world history that actually leads to the current state of humanity right now, basically covering like a 300-year gap. Amai starts by mentioning that the world is currently entering a third era of change. In the first era of change long ago, Earth had many nations that fought for land and resources through countless world wars. Eventually the population decreased to the point that humanity finally started to prioritize the preservation of future generations and unified under one world government. In the second era of change, the aftermath from all the world wars caused the Earth to slowly erode and create toxic, uninhabitable sections of the planet. Rapid climate change and rising sea levels gave birth to what are now known as monsters, which then forced humanity to migrate to the center of a supercontinent where they all live now and where all of the major cities from A to Z exist. This is actually very reminiscent of an Attack on Titan scenario, where like the cities from A to Z are pretty much the stronghold of humanity at this point, and I feel like that isn't touched on enough in the series, so I actually hope this becomes a bigger plot point eventually. Well, all that being said, the world is currently entering a third era of change where monsters are now becoming more intelligent and rising in numbers dramatically. Amai also points out that just a few years ago, monster appearances were very rare, and now, as Saitama actually said in chapter 186 of the manga, you're more likely to run into a monster than find a beetle scurrying on the ground. This bit of extremely valuable world building laid out by Amai Mask seems to explain the origin of monsters and the fact that humans were engaging in world wars as far back as a few hundred years. Amai describes the first era of change as long ago, meaning it was probably many generations before theirs, and the time it would take for a mass migration of humanity to a supercontinent, along with the establishment of a world government, in my opinion kind of confirms that these events happened at a minimum of 200 or 300 years ago. So that being said, we'll add the 3 eras of change beginning at 300 BS, and for continuity's sake, this would be roughly 500 years after the events of the cruel dragon. So now we finally arrive to probably the greatest moment in One Punch Man human history, and that of course is the day that Saitama was born. He came into this world bald, and he's bald now. Not much is known about Saitama's early days, and essentially nothing is known about who raised him. Thankfully though, I've dug deep enough into bonus chapters and various other bits of valuable info that might finally uncover some of the mysteries of Saitama's early life that help explain how he became the unstoppable bald hero we all know and love today. Along with this, there's still a plethora of major events that occur from the moment Saitama was born to the current timeline that truly show how quickly the world is approaching extinction level disaster. And surprisingly, it all starts with the #1 hero, potentially the first ever hero, Zero Blast, which is where we'll be picking up in part 2 of the history of One Punch Man. So subscribe and turn on those notifications so you don't miss the release of part 2, and I'll see you there.